November 19, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the flat Texas landscape, carrying its cargo of defeated enemies toward an uncertain future. Inside, 23 German women sat in tense silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms dusty and wrinkled from weeks of travel across the Atlantic and then by rail through the American heartland. They were members of the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the Women's Auxiliary Communications Corps, captured during the Allied advance through France. Now they were being delivered to Camp Pine Ridge, a hastily converted facility outside of Austin, Texas, designed to hold female prisoners of war. 21-year-old Margaret Hoffman pressed her face against the small window, watching the strange landscape roll past. Everything here seemed too big, too open, too different from the cramped cities and war-torn countryside of Germany. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, a brilliant blue that seemed almost offensive in its cheerfulness. Back home, the skies were gray with smoke and ash. Back home, there was nothing cheerful left. Beside her, 18-year-old Elsa Fischer clutched a small photograph of her family in Hamburg. Her hands trembled slightly, though whether from fear or exhaustion, even she couldn't say. The younger woman had been a radio operator for only 6 months before her capture, barely trained before being thrust into the chaos of the German retreat. Now she faced an unknown fate in a country she had been taught to hate and fear. The propaganda they had absorbed during their service painted vivid pictures of what awaited captured German soldiers in American hands. They had been told that Americans were barbaric, that they showed no mercy to prisoners, especially to women who had dared to serve the Reich. Some of the women had heard whispered rumors of worse fates, stories designed to prevent surrender at all costs. As the truck slowed and turned through the gates of Camp Pine Ridge, every woman braced herself for the brutality they expected to face. What they saw instead confused them more than any cruelty could have. The camp was simple but clean, with neat rows of wooden barracks surrounded by standard fencing and guard towers. American soldiers stood at attention as the truck passed, but their faces showed curiosity rather than hatred. One young guard even nodded politely as the vehicle rolled by, a gesture so ordinary and so unexpected that several women exchanged bewildered glances. The truck stopped in front of the administrative building. The rear gate opened, revealing a middle-aged American officer in crisp uniform. She was a woman, which surprised them further. Major Helen Crawford stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her expression neutral but not unkind. She surveyed the exhausted prisoners with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too much war and too much suffering. "Welcome to Camp Pine Ridge," she said in clear, measured English that the women with language training could partially understand. "You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will be given quarters, clothing, and meals. You will be safe here." Safe. The word seemed impossible. They were prisoners of war in enemy territory. How could they possibly be safe? Margaret caught the eye of Elsa, seeing her own confusion reflected back. They had prepared themselves for many things, but not for this. Not for the possibility that their enemies might actually mean them no harm. The barracks assigned to the German women were sparse but surprisingly clean. Wooden bunks lined both walls, each with a thin mattress, a folded blanket, and a pillow. It was more than many of them had seen in months. During the final chaotic weeks before their capture, they had slept in bombed-out buildings, abandoned barns, and once, memorably, in a ditch while artillery fire screamed overhead. This plain wooden structure with its intact roof and shuttered windows seemed almost luxurious by comparison. Margaret claimed a lower bunk near the center of the room and sat down carefully, testing the mattress. It was firm but not uncomfortable. Else took the bunk above hers, climbing up with the cautious movements of someone expecting the structure to collapse at any moment. Around them, the other women began to settle in, speaking in hushed German, their voices carrying the weight of exhaustion and uncertainty. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. They were truly prisoners now, completely at the mercy of a nation they had been fighting against. Everything familiar had been stripped away. Their homeland was thousands of miles across an ocean they would not see again for months, perhaps years. Their families had no idea where they were, or even if they were still alive. Letters sent through the International Red Cross could take months to arrive, if they arrived at all, but it was hunger that dominated their immediate thoughts. Real, gnawing hunger that had become their constant companion over the past months. The final weeks before their capture had been a nightmare of dwindling supplies and missed meals. The German army's logistics had collapsed as Allied forces advanced, leaving support personnel like themselves scrounging for whatever food they could find. Margaret had lost nearly 15 pounds since summer. Her uniform, once fitted properly, now hung loose on her frame. Else was even thinner. At 18, she should have been in the bloom of youth, but months of inadequate nutrition had left her gaunt and hollow-eyed. She had confided to Margaret during their transport that she sometimes dreamed of food more vividly than she dreamed of home. Simple things: dark bread with butter, potato soup with actual chunks of potato in it. Once, memorably, she had dreamed of her mother's apple strudel and woken with tears on her face. The other women shared similar stories. Hildegard Schneider, a sturdy woman from Bavaria who had worked as a telegraph operator, spoke quietly about the week when their unit had survived on watered-down vegetable broth and stale crackers. Liesel Wagner, thin and nervous, described the day she had fainted at her post from hunger, only to be revived with a cup of ersatz coffee so weak it was barely colored water. They had all learned what it meant to be truly hungry, to feel their bodies consuming themselves for fuel. So when the announcement came that evening meal would be served in 30 minutes, the women exchanged wary glances. What would American prison food be like? Would it be enough to sustain them, or would they continue to waste away behind enemy wire? Some of the propaganda they had absorbed suggested that Americans might deliberately starve their prisoners, treating them as the Nazis had treated their captives. Others whispered that perhaps they would be fed scraps, leftovers not fit for American consumption. Margaret organized the women into a line, maintaining the military discipline that had been drilled into them. Whatever awaited them in that mess hall, they would face it with dignity. They were still soldiers of the Reich, even in defeat. They would not show weakness or desperation, no matter how empty their stomachs felt. The first evening meal had been simple but adequate. Beef stew with actual chunks of meat, fresh bread, and coffee that tasted like real coffee. The women had eaten in stunned silence, unable to reconcile this abundance with their expectations. That night, lying in their bunks, many of them had struggled to sleep, their minds racing with questions they couldn't answer. Why were their enemies feeding them so well? What did the Americans want in return? Morning came early at Camp Pine Ridge. A bell rang at 6 o'clock, sharp and clear in the cold November dawn. Margaret woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. For a brief, confused moment, she thought she was back at the communications post in France. Then reality settled over her like a heavy blanket. She was a prisoner. This was her new life. The women dressed quickly in the clean uniforms that had been provided the night before. They were still German military issue, but freshly laundered and without the stains and tears that had marked their captured clothing. Someone had taken the time to ensure they had proper attire. Even this small gesture seemed strange and unsettling. Else climbed down from her bunk, her movement still carrying the hesitancy of someone not quite believing in their own safety. She had barely slept, Margaret could tell. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands shook slightly as she buttoned her uniform jacket. The younger woman had been having nightmares, crying out in German about bombs and fire. Several of the other women had similar troubles. War didn't release its grip on the mind simply because the fighting had stopped. They assembled outside the barracks as instructed, forming neat rows in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath misted in the chilly air. Texas was warmer than Germany in November, but the mornings still carried a bite. An American soldier, a young private whose name tag read Riley, counted them with professional efficiency and then gestured for them to follow him toward the mess hall. The building was larger than the barracks, with windows that glowed with warm yellow light. As they approached, Margaret caught a smell that made her stop mid-step. It was sweet, rich, and completely foreign. Something was cooking that she didn't recognize, something that made her stomach clench with sudden, unexpected hunger, despite the previous night's meal. Behind her, she heard Elsa inhale sharply, catching the same scent. They filed into the mess hall and stopped collectively, creating a bottleneck at the entrance that Private Riley had to gently urge forward. The large room held long tables with benches, all scrupulously clean. But it was what waited at the serving line that captured their complete attention. American soldiers, both men and women, stood behind steam tables laden with food. Not the simple portions of last night's stew, but something else entirely. Something that made no sense for a prison camp breakfast. Sergeant Dorothy Martinez, a stocky woman with kind eyes and graying hair, stood at the center of the serving line. She smiled at the confused German women and gestured toward the trays. "Good morning, ladies," she said in slow, clear English. "Breakfast is served. We've got French toast with maple syrup, scrambled eggs, bacon, and fresh orange juice. Help yourselves." The translator, Corporal Sarah Bennett, repeated the words in careful German, but the translation hardly mattered. The women could see what was being offered. Stacks of golden brown bread glistening with something dark and liquid. The sweet smell that had drawn them from across the camp came from those plates, from that mysterious syrup that caught the light like amber. Margaret stood frozen, unable to process what she was seeing. This was breakfast? For prisoners? The abundance seemed obscene, impossible. Else gripped her arm tightly, her thin fingers digging in through the uniform sleeve. Around them, the other women stood equally paralyzed, staring at food unlike anything they had encountered before. Private Riley noticed their hesitation and spoke quietly to Corporal Bennett, who stepped forward with a gentle smile. "It's all right," she said in German. "This is your breakfast. Please take a tray and serve yourselves. There's plenty for everyone. Plenty." The word seemed alien in its context. For the past year, there had never been plenty of anything. Plenty meant waste, meant excess, meant a world that no longer existed. Yet here it was, steaming on metal trays in an enemy prison camp, being offered freely to captured soldiers who had fought against these very people. Margaret forced herself to move forward, taking a metal tray from the stack. Her hands felt disconnected from her body, operating on automatic, while her mind struggled to comprehend the situation. Else followed close behind, her breathing quick and shallow. One by one, the other women joined the line, moving like people in a dream. Sergeant Martinez served the first portion herself, carefully placing 3 thick slices of the golden bread onto Margaret's plate. The bread was clearly not ordinary bread. It had been soaked in something, cooked until the outside turned a rich caramel color and now glistened with moisture. Martinez then took a metal pitcher and poured a stream of dark amber liquid over the bread. The syrup, thick and viscous, pooled around the slices and soaked into their surface. "Maple syrup," Martinez said, though Margaret didn't understand the English words. "Real Vermont maple syrup. Enjoy, honey." Margaret stared down at her plate. The sweet smell rising from the food was almost overwhelming. Her mouth watered involuntarily, a physical response she couldn't control. Behind her, she heard Elsa make a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. The younger woman's tray was being loaded with the same golden portions, the same generous pour of syrup. They moved down the line mechanically, scrambled eggs, fluffy and yellow, studded with what looked like cheese, strips of bacon, crispy and still sizzling slightly. A small glass filled with bright orange juice that caught the light, like liquid sunshine. By the time Margaret reached the end of the serving line, her tray was laden with more food than she had seen on a single plate in over a year. The women carried their trays to the nearest table and sat down in a tight group, instinctively seeking the security of proximity. For a long moment, nobody moved. They simply stared at their plates, at the abundance that made no sense, at the sweetness that seemed to mock everything they had experienced during the war's final months. Hildegard Schneider was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" she asked in German. "What are they trying to do to us?" Margareta picked up her fork with trembling fingers. The metal felt heavy in her hand. She cut into the golden bread, watching the syrup flow into the cut she had made. The texture was soft, almost custardy, completely unlike the dense, dark bread she had known all her life. She raised the fork to her lips, and the moment the food touched her tongue, her eyes widened. The taste was beyond anything in her experience. Sweet, rich with butter and egg and something indefinable. The syrup carried flavors of wood and smoke and autumn, complex and deep. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. Margaret set down her fork, but her hands continued to tremble. She pressed them flat against the table, trying to steady herself, but the shaking only intensified. Across from her, Elsa had taken her first bite, and now sat frozen, tears streaming down her thin face. The younger woman wasn't sobbing, wasn't making any sound at all. She simply sat with tears falling onto her plate while she stared at the food as if it had betrayed her somehow. Around the table, similar reactions rippled through the group of German women. Liesel Wagner's fork clattered against her plate as her hands shook too violently to hold it steady. Clara Bauer had covered her face with both hands, her shoulders shaking. Hildegard Schneider, the sturdy Bavarian who had maintained her composure through capture and transport and imprisonment, now sat with her head bowed, her jaw clenched so tightly that muscles stood out in her neck. The American soldiers, observing from their posts, exchanged confused glances. Sergeant Martinez approached the table slowly, concern evident on her face. She spoke to Corporal Bennett in quick, worried English. The translator listened, then turned to address the German women. "Is something wrong with the food?" Bennett asked in German. "Are you ill? Do you need medical attention?" Margaret forced herself to look up at the American corporal. How could she possibly explain what was wrong? How could she put into words the overwhelming wrongness of this kindness, the way it shattered every certainty she had built her world upon? She had been prepared for cruelty, for deprivation, for punishment. She had steeled herself to endure whatever her captors might inflict upon defeated enemies. But this generosity that asked nothing in return, this food that tasted like something from a dream, served without ceremony or conditions, this violated everything she had been taught about Americans, about enemies, about the fundamental nature of war itself. The propaganda had painted pictures of brutal captors who would starve and abuse their prisoners. Yet here she sat, trembling before a breakfast that her own family in Germany could not have afforded even before the war. "We are not ill," Margaret managed to say in halting English, one of the few phrases she knew. Then, switching to German, hoping the translator would convey her meaning, she continued, "We are not accustomed to such food. We do not understand why you give us this." Bennett translated for Martinez, whose expression softened with understanding. The sergeant pulled out a chair and sat down at the table with the German women, a gesture that seemed to surprise even the other American soldiers watching. She spoke slowly, gesturing as she talked, while Bennett translated. "This is standard breakfast," Martinez explained. "This is what we serve to everyone on this base. You're not being given special treatment. You're simply being fed the same food we eat ourselves. The Geneva Convention requires that we treat prisoners humanely, but beyond that, it's just the right thing to do. You're human beings, and human beings deserve to eat decent food." The translator's words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of confusion and disbelief. Else wiped at her tears with shaking hands. The breakfast that morning marked a turning point, though none of the women recognized it at the time. They finished their meals in near silence, each bite a small act of courage against the cognitive dissonance threatening to overwhelm them. The French toast, with its golden sweetness, became a symbol of something they couldn't yet name, a crack in the foundation of everything they thought they knew about their enemies. Over the following days, meals continued to arrive with the same bewildering abundance. Lunch brought thick sandwiches with actual meat, fresh vegetables, and sometimes even desserts. Apple pie, chocolate cake, cookies that crumbled sweetly in their mouths. Dinner featured roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans cooked with butter. Every meal challenged their understanding of captivity, of punishment, of what it meant to be a defeated enemy. But it was breakfast that became the focal point of their transformation. Every morning, the French toast appeared, golden and sweet, drenched in maple syrup that caught the light. And every morning, Margaret watched her fellow prisoners struggle with the same trembling hands, the same confused tears, the same inability to reconcile kindness with captivity. Sergeant Martinez seemed to understand their struggle in ways the German women hadn't expected. She began sitting with them during meals, not as a guard maintaining order, but as something approaching a companion. Through Corporal Bennett's translations, she told them about her own life, about growing up poor in New Mexico, about joining the military to escape poverty and finding purpose instead. "Food matters," Martinez told them one morning, watching as Elsa hesitantly cut into her French toast. "My grandmother used to say that how you feed people tells them who they are. If you feed someone garbage, you're telling them they're garbage. If you feed someone with care and dignity, you're telling them they matter. You all matter, even here, even now." The words, translated carefully by Bennett, settled over the table like a benediction. Hildegard Schneider, who had remained largely silent since their arrival, finally spoke. "In Germany," she said slowly, "we were told that Americans were wasteful, that you had so much you didn't value anything. But this is not waste, is it? This is intention." Martinez smiled, understanding the question even before Bennett translated. "That's right, this is choice. We choose to see you as people who deserve to eat well. That doesn't erase the war, doesn't change that we were enemies, but it means we don't have to treat each other as less than human." Private Riley, the young soldier who had first escorted them to the mess hall, began bringing them small luxuries. Extra butter for their toast, a second glass of orange juice, once a handful of strawberries that he said came from his family's farm back home. Each gesture was small, almost insignificant, yet each one chipped away at the walls the German women had built around themselves. They began to notice other things too. The kindness they received in the mess hall extended beyond meals. American guards greeted them politely each morning. The camp doctor, a soft-spoken man from Pennsylvania, treated their ailments with the same care he showed American soldiers. Clean laundry appeared regularly. The barracks remained heated as Texas winter arrived. Every courtesy, every small act of humanity added weight to a burden the German women hadn't anticipated carrying: guilt. Margaret lay awake at night thinking about the French toast, about maple syrup in abundance, about Sergeant Martinez sitting at their table as if they were equals. She thought about the propaganda posters she had seen in Germany, the ones depicting Americans as cruel and barbaric. She thought about the speeches she had heard about the inferiority of their enemies, about how Germany's cause was righteous and its methods justified. Then she thought about the reality she now faced daily: Americans who smiled at her, Americans who ensured she had enough to eat, Americans who treated her capture not as an opportunity for revenge, but as a responsibility to uphold human dignity. The dissonance was crushing. Els had begun having different nightmares. She no longer dreamed of bombs and fire. Now she dreamed of the people she might have hurt through her service, of the communications she had relayed that might have led to deaths. She woke crying, whispering apologies in German to people who couldn't hear her, who might not even exist anymore. "How can they be so kind to us?" Els asked Margaret one evening as they prepared for sleep. "After everything our country did, after everything we were part of?" Margaret had no answer. She was beginning to realize that none of them truly understood what they had been part of. News from Europe filtered into the camp through newspapers that Corporal Bennett sometimes translated for them. The reports spoke of Allied advances, of German cities falling, of refugees streaming across borders. But there were other stories too, darker ones, that the women couldn't fully comprehend yet. Hildegard had started attending the voluntary English classes that Corporal Bennett offered in the evenings. She explained her reasoning to the others with characteristic bluntness. If we are to understand where we are and what is happening, we must learn their language. We cannot remain ignorant. The word ignorant stung, but it was accurate. They had been ignorant of so much, ignorant of what their government was truly doing, ignorant of what war actually meant beyond the sanitized propaganda they had absorbed, ignorant of the possibility that their enemies might possess more humanity than their own leaders had shown. Major Crawford, the camp commander, called Margaret to her office one December morning. Through a translator, she asked a simple question that carried enormous weight. "Do you understand now why we feed you well?" Margaret met the major's eyes and answered honestly, "I understand that you are showing us what we should have been shown all along, that even enemies deserve dignity. I understand that this is mercy we do not deserve, but are receiving anyway." Crawford nodded slowly. Winter gave way to spring at Camp Pine Ridge, and with the changing season came a transformation that none of the German women could have predicted. The walls between captors and captives had been crumbling steadily since that first breakfast of French toast and maple syrup, but now they seemed to disappear almost entirely. Margaret had become fluent enough in English to hold basic conversations without Corporal Bennett's help. She discovered that Private Riley was only 19 years old, younger than she was, and that he missed his family's farm with an ache she recognized. Sergeant Martinez had lost her husband in the Pacific Theater, a fact that made her kindness toward German prisoners even more remarkable and incomprehensible. The women were given work assignments based on their skills and interests. Else, despite her youth, proved to have a talent for clerical organization and began helping in the camp's administrative office. Hildegard worked in the motor pool, her mechanical aptitude surprising the American soldiers who had assumed women couldn't understand engines. Liesel assisted in the library, cataloging books and learning English through constant reading. Margaret found herself working alongside Sergeant Martinez in the mess hall, learning American cooking techniques and the stories behind the food. Martinez taught her how to make proper French toast, explaining the importance of the egg mixture's consistency, the right temperature for the griddle, the way real maple syrup should pour like liquid gold. "Food is memory," Martinez told her one morning as they prepared breakfast. "Every dish carries stories. This French toast reminds me of Sunday mornings with my grandmother. What will it remind you of?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "It will remind me of the morning I learned that enemies could be kind, that propaganda could be wrong, that I had been living in a version of the world that did not actually exist." But April brought news that shattered the fragile peace they had constructed. Reports from Europe spoke of concentration camps being liberated by Allied forces. The newspapers carried photographs that Corporal Bennett initially hesitated to show the German women, images of skeletal prisoners, of mass graves, of horrors that defied comprehension. Major Crawford called a mandatory assembly and had Bennett read the reports aloud in German. The women sat in stunned silence as the translator described Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. Places most of them had never heard of, atrocities they could barely process. When Bennett finished reading, Hildegard raised her hand, her voice shaking. "This cannot be real. Our government, our country, we could not." Crawford's response was gentle but firm. "The evidence is overwhelming. These camps existed. These atrocities happened. They happened in your country's name, whether you knew about them or not." That night, the barracks filled with the sounds of women weeping. Elze clung to Margaret in the darkness, her thin body shaking with sobs. "What were we serving?" she whispered. What did we help make possible? Margaret had no comfort to offer, only her own tears joining Elsa's in the dark. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived at Camp Pine Ridge with muted celebration. The American soldiers rejoiced at the end of the European War, but their joy was tempered by awareness of the German women who sat in the barracks, confronting what their nation's defeat truly meant. Major Crawford called another assembly 3 days after VE Day. The German women gathered in the mess hall, the same place where they had first encountered French toast and maple syrup 6 months earlier. That morning felt like a lifetime ago. They had been different people then, convinced of their righteousness, certain of their understanding of the world. Crawford stood before them with official documents in her hands. Corporal Bennett stood beside her, ready to translate. The major's expression was serious, but not unkind. "Ladies," Crawford began, waiting for Bennett's translation, "the war in Europe has ended. Arrangements are being made for the repatriation of all prisoners of war. Within the next several weeks, you will be transported back to Germany through displaced persons camps in Europe. You will be processed and released to return to your homes." The words should have brought relief, even joy. Instead, they landed like stones. Return home. To what? To cities in ruins? To families that might no longer exist? To a country that had committed atrocities beyond imagination? To a Germany that no longer resembled anything they had once known? Margaret felt Elsa's hand find hers under the table, gripping tightly. Around them, the other women sat rigid with tension. This was the moment they had been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. Crawford paused, observing their reactions. Then she continued, "However, I want you to understand something. Repatriation is your right under international law, but given the extraordinary circumstances, given what you now know about your country's actions, and given the uncertainty you face about what awaits you there, I want you to know that there may be other options." Bennett's translation caused a ripple of confusion through the assembled women. Other options? What could that possibly mean? "The War Department is considering," Crawford continued carefully, "special provisions for prisoners who have demonstrated genuine transformation and who face particular hardships upon repatriation. This is unprecedented, and I cannot make any promises. But I am asking each of you to consider carefully what you truly want for your future." After the assembly ended, the women gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed, urgent German. Hildegard voiced what many were thinking. She is asking if we want to stay here, in America, with them. The idea seemed impossible, absurd, yet it resonated with something deep inside Margaret. She thought about the past 6 months, about learning to make French toast alongside Sergeant Martinez, about Private Riley teaching her English phrases while telling stories about his farm, about Major Crawford treating them with dignity even when revealing their nation's crimes. She thought about what waited in Germany, ruins and guilt and accusations. Here, she had found something unexpected, the possibility of redemption through small daily acts of kindness, both received and given. The decision took 3 weeks to finalize. Of the 23 German women at Camp Pine Ridge, 14 chose repatriation. They would return to Germany to face whatever remained of their former lives with courage and dignity. 9 women, including Margaret, Elsa, and Hildegard, made a choice that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. They chose to stay. The process was complicated, requiring special dispensations from the War Department, sponsorships from American families, and promises of employment. Sergeant Martinez sponsored Margaret, offering her a position working at her family's restaurant in New Mexico. Private Riley's family sponsored Elsa, providing housing and work on their Iowa farm. Hildegard secured employment at a factory in Austin, her mechanical skills finally valued and utilized. The morning the repatriation group departed, the mess hall served French toast one final time. Both groups of women sat together, sharing the meal that had become their unexpected common ground. Tears flowed freely now, no longer from shock or confusion, but from genuine sorrow at parting. Liesel Wagner, who had chosen to return to Germany, embraced Margaret tightly. "Tell them our story," she whispered in German. "Tell them that we learned something here, that enemies became friends over breakfast, that kindness can transform even those who have been part of terrible things." "I will," Margaret promised. "And you tell them in Germany. Tell them what Americans can be, what mercy looks like, what redemption means." Major Crawford made a brief speech as the transport trucks waited outside. "You came here as enemies," she said, her voice steady. "You leave as human beings who have chosen different paths forward. Both paths require courage. Both paths honor what you have learned here. Carry forward the truth that people can change, that understanding can replace hatred, and that small acts of kindness matter more than grand declarations." After the trucks departed, the 9 remaining women stood in estranged silence. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were no longer enemies, but they were not yet fully American either. They existed in a liminal space, belonging nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. That evening, Sergeant Martinez invited Margaret to help prepare dinner in the mess hall. Together, they made French toast for the remaining women, a small celebration of endings and beginnings. As Margaret poured the maple syrup, her hands steady now, she remembered that first morning when everything had changed. "Are you afraid?" Martinez asked, watching her work. Margaret considered the question carefully. "Yes," she admitted, "but I am also hopeful. That morning when you first served us French toast, my hands shook because I could not understand kindness from enemies. Now I understand that kindness is not about enemies or friends. It is about choosing to see humanity even when it would be easier not to." Years later, Margaret would tell her children about the morning that changed everything. About golden bread and liquid amber, about trembling hands and the moment when sweetness broke through bitterness, about how the smallest gestures of humanity can transform lives in ways that grand speeches and dramatic moments never could.